Like to bring in now into the conversation Hal Kempfer, retired Marines intelligence officer, friend of the program, also co-host of the STRAT podcast. Hal, thanks for being with us on this Sunday. I'd like to start with this latest news. So this UN resolution was vetoed on Friday. Why did the U.S. opt to do that?
Well, it's kind of interesting. This UN resolution did not have any language condemning the October 7th attacks. Britain abstained from the vote, and they cited that very reason. They said, look, we really can't have a resolution like this unless you're first going to address what got this whole thing going, which is October 7th and the horrific terrorist actions, killing innocent women, children, old people, everybody else, these attacks in southern Israel, and it didn't have that in there. The U.S. Did not disagree. Actually, that's part of the backdrop of the U.S. opposition. But the U.S. position is basically that ceasefire at this point won't do anything to help the situation on the ground. Matter of fact, the ceasefire at this point would probably just prolong the war, since Hamas would use it as time to regroup, rearm, do everything else, and then that would make the war longer, probably more deadly and horrific over the long run. And they're looking at the momentum that the IDF has, the Israeli Defense Forces have right now. And they're saying, look, just keep the war going. Try to minimize civilian casualties. That's obviously a huge issue. But they didn't see the ceasefire really accomplishing anything. So that was the crux of the U.S. position, although it does kind of mirror the UK position in terms of condemnation of October 7th. And that is really a failure of the UN, that there hasn't been that strong condemnation coming out of the National Security Council on October 7th. And some of that is actions that Russia has been playing, and to some extent China, basically not overly siding with Hamas, but doing things that seem to be very much in concert with the desires of not just Hamas, but more importantly, its big state sponsor, Iran.
Okay, then let's talk about what's happening on the ground in Gaza. Let's take a look here, a live vantage point out of southern Israel. A lot of lights here, but then when I go to this other look into Gaza, I mean, very dark. So what have we been seeing these last few days? Right now, it's really quiet, but earlier I did see some flares off in the distance.
And that's because the Israelis are doing night operations. There's a number of reasons to use flares. Obviously, it lightens up everything on the ground. That's why they're there. What it does is it's something you can do to, if you detect what you think is movement by the enemy, you can put flares up, and obviously it'll stop that movement, but you actually might catch them in the open, and then you can take them under fire. There are times when you may be conducting operations at night where you need to light up the situation just so your own troops can see what's going on. With that said, of the two forces, Israeli Defense Forces versus Hamas, Israel has the far better optics for operating at night. They kind of own the night, if you will. So they're in a much better position to operate without flares. So those may have been defensive flares for the most part. Don't know exactly what every tactical situation is in the Gaza Strip right now. So one can only guess. But Israel is pushing forward. As you can see in northern Gaza, and I believe that is looking into northern Gaza, the lights are out, literally. And Israel is consolidating essentially ownership, if you will, of northern Gaza. They're in a very good position on the ground. There is discussion, and there are indications there may have been actually some action in terms of flooding some of the underground tunnels, some of that vast Gaza metro, if you will, that 400 miles of tunnels. But no one's really sure how interconnected they are. No one's really sure in terms of the ventilation and everything else. If you flood one tunnel, does it flood a bunch of other tunnels? How many levels does this thing go down? It's really, it's such a vast network that no one's quite sure if you start pumping water in, first, where it will all go, and then second, how long it will take. I mean, there's some discussion that they may start pumping in a lot of water very quickly, and it may take weeks to fill up the tunnels just because of how they're interconnected with other tunnels. So that's something that we're not seeing obviously up front, but it's something that's being discussed and widely shown. It's very possible in the Gaza Strip, in the northern Gaza Strip. Now, if you go down to the south in Khan Yunis, that's the big Hamas stronghold. That's where Yahya Sinwar, the head of basically the militant side of Hamas, that's where he is set up. And he's actually down there. It was said as of yesterday and the day before that the Israelis had essentially surrounded where he lives. It's believed he literally went to ground. He went underground, but it's believed that he's down there, and so they may be taking him out at some point here very quickly. If he goes, there has been a question of what impact that will have on the war itself. But they're moving on the ground. The IDF is supposed to be literally in the center of Khan Yunis. They have fought their way to the center of the city, and that is the biggest city to the south. And once you take Khan Yunis, then you're really looking at Rafah. But that gets into a huge logistical challenge that the IDF has to deal with, which is where do you tell the Palestinian civilians to go? You've basically taken over a big chunk of the south. You've taken over the north. Where do they go for safe haven? And certainly moving them in the south from Khan Yunis and that region to Rafah has not been without a lot of controversy, not without a lot of hurdles that they had to go through in order to get that movement. And I can't say it was completely successful across the board, but they got a lot of people to move. But where do they go then? And at that point, do you set up a screening line for people to move out of the Rafah region? And once they move through that Rafah region, where do they go? Do you have to set up major tent cities, refugee camps, all this stuff? How do you deal with the care, feeding, medical care, everything else of over 2 million Palestinian civilians that are now trapped in this very, very closed space around Rafah in southern Gaza? That's a big question, a big challenge, not just for Israel, but also the international community. How are they going to work with this as well?
See, and that's the thing, Hal, because the international community is calling on Israel to reduce these civilian casualties. But we got a big problem on our hands where we don't know where to direct these civilians in Gaza. I mean, at this point, it seems that there's no real plan in place to make sure that the number of casualties is going to be reduced as the fighting continues.
It's a big challenge. The aid trucks are going into southern Gaza. I think it was on Friday I saw over 100 trucks had gone in. Saudi Arabia sent aid trucks in. Jordan has sent aid trucks in. Obviously, the trucks coming in from primarily through the Rafah Gate at Egypt. A lot of international aid. The U.S. has been providing a lot of aid as well. There's at least 1 to 3 field hospitals. One was Jordanian that have been set up in southern Gaza. So there's a lot of things going in there. Is it enough? That's a big question. You know, before the war, there were over 400 trucks a day that went into the Gaza Strip. Now, keep in mind that the Gaza Strip was a lot more dispersed at that time, and the situation was somewhat normal. So a lot of those trucks would have been carrying things that aren't absolutely essential. Now what they bring is stuff that is truly essential. But there is over 100 trucks, although when the ceasefire ended, it dropped dramatically down below that, and then it started picking up again. Israel is also doing a lot of airstrikes in Gaza, but it looks like they're taking great care not to hit certain civilian areas. And if you look, whereas the estimated loss of total loss of life is said to be over 18,000. Again, that is a Hamas number. That's the terrorist group that started this whole thing. They're going in position as they want to make Israel look as bad as possible. So exaggerating and mischaracterizing losses is not something that's actually part of their strategy. That's what they do. It's not something that's like, oh, by the way, they might be doing this. If they're not doing this, I would be shocked and stunned if they weren't using it for propaganda purposes. But with that said, Haaretz, major news outlet in Israel, has said that the civilian casualties compared to military or terrorist casualties might be a little over 60% civilian to terrorists. So it is pretty high. It's higher than normal warfare, but as the IDF has brought out, it is much lower than historical norms for dense urban warfare. And what you're seeing in Gaza is dense urban warfare. You know, multiple levels, surface, above surface, below surface. very narrow streets, densely packed, populated areas. So in that regard, it's below historical norms. But in most wars, to include wars within the Middle East and Gaza, the loss of civilian life is compared to loss of military casualties, if you will, is higher than that historical norm. And of course, those who want a ceasefire point to the overall history, and Israel points very strongly at the history of urban warfare. So there is a bit of a divergence opinion, and the numbers are not clear. Is it over 18,000? Don't know. And certainly with Hamas in much smaller attacks, their estimates of the losses have been anywhere from 2 to 3 to 10 times higher than they actually were. So it's difficult to say what exactly the losses are, but everybody's pointing to that, and that's the humanitarian disaster they're pointing to, and that's a lot of the international impetus, to include the impetus at the UN for the ceasefire, and the calls for a ceasefire right now is pointing at that. However, as we talked about before, they're getting down to that Rafah quarter, and they've got to figure out where do they go next.
And then just to kind of piggyback off of that point that you mentioned, because we've talked about this before, but for any viewers that may have missed it, it is very difficult to get an exact number of the casualties, especially when you're talking about a war. And so very have to be very cautious, if you will, when we report the numbers in Gaza that we are getting from the Hamas-led organization that is giving these numbers, because the UN and other organizations, they can't go in there and verify that. And just want to reiterate one more time that it is very difficult, right, Hal, to even get an exact number as we've been getting.
Not only is it very difficult, this is what I find interesting, and you know this from the news. You know, there's a fire that sweeps through Lahaina in Maui. We had all kinds of trouble figuring out how many people were killed or lost in that fire. It varied wildly over the coming week or weeks until they finally settled down close to 100. But it was a huge amount that were missing and everything else. And then we have the same problem with natural disasters in the U.S. all the time, whether it's floods or tornadoes or hurricanes. It takes a long time to settle down those numbers. And in the news cycle, we always see in the immediate aftermath of a disaster, we'll report numbers that usually are well below what they were said to be initially. And then they creep up as more people get into various homes, buildings, people, places where people live. And once they get in there, then they can see what the actual numbers are. You know, there is one example I can point to. October 7th, in many ways, has been compared to 9/11. I can tell you that on 9/11, there were estimates that the loss of life could be anywhere from 20,000 to 30,000 people in New York, because of they just looked at the normal amount of people that were in the World Trade Center complex. And then they started guesstimating how many might have got out based on a lot of things, not to mention the horrible problem they had back in 1993 when there was a Al Qaeda bombing in the basement, and they tried to evacuate the building, and so many people did not get out, and it was just an absolute mess. So they kind of took that, and then as the day progressed, the numbers. A lot of people were missing, but as people would call in, say, "Hey, this is where I am," that's where we got closer down to below 3,000 and above 2,000, and it kind of stayed hovering there for quite some time until they got the exact numbers of people who were killed. So in that case, it was greatly exaggerated. What I'm just basically saying is, Hamas puts out numbers with great exactitude very quickly. And I always have questions about that. How do you know how many people were killed in that building that collapsed if you can't get into the building that collapsed? How do you know? How is it that Hamas somehow has this ability to put out these very exact numbers of people killed when all the major countries in the world in natural disasters or other things or building collapses, we don't seem to be able to do that. But here in the middle of this combat zone where the government is essentially fallen apart within there, they do that. And that just to me is a big indicator that Hamas is, I'm not saying they're throwing darts at the wall, but they are somewhat pulling numbers out of a hat that I don't think have a lot of validity in some cases. It's just the numbers that they guesstimate, and if they guesstimate, it's on the high side. And when they say the number of women and children compared to terrorists that were killed, they tend to exaggerate that number greatly. And in many cases, they've said, oh, it was women and children killed. And then when you actually get reporters in there with video, it's like, really, women and children, all that seem to be military age adult men, yet you're saying it's women and children. There's something that's not quite right with what we're seeing and what you're saying, what saying it is that we're seeing. So I just wanted to say that that's something I've seen consistently throughout this entire war.
I mean, definitely it raises a lot more questions than it does provide answers. Let's stay with this topic of Iranian proxies, because it's not just Hamas terrorists that are causing havoc around the world. We also have the Houthi rebels based in Yemen, and we've heard a few reports about them attacking U.S. commercial ships, warships out there in the Red Sea. Here is some video. But Hal, what are we hearing lately when it comes to this? I know that these attacks, they have been escalating, and I think that just in the last few days, more attacks have been happening as well.
There have been a lot of attacks. I think as of, I believe it was Wednesday, 78 total attacks on U.S. bases, primarily Iraq and Syria, the focus there. They had fired on the embassy compound in what's called the Green Zone in Baghdad in Syria. Something we hadn't seen for a while. I just saw a report that said they had done it again. A number of mortars had gone into the embassy compound in Baghdad. There are some weapon systems that we have that are used to counter those types of attacks. They're very effective. More difficult to use in urban areas because they basically fire rounds at an incoming warhead or missile, and those rounds are going to land somewhere too. So you have to use it with a certain bit of amount of prudence in order to avoid collateral damage. In the Red Sea, the Houthis have been saying, look, they're going to fire on any commercial ship that they think might be in any way connected with Israel. And some of their choices of ships, one scratches your head to try and find the connection to Israel. They're not flagged to Israel, which means the flag that the ship is registered under. They're not headed for an Israeli port. They're not owned by an Israeli company. In some cases, they've said some of these companies or the cargoes themselves are primarily owned by businesses, albeit not in Israel, but primarily owned by capital interests from Israel, or capital interests are connected to Israel. They've done some homework. I don't think some of the homework the Houthis have done is all that great. But what it's done is it's dramatically spiked insurance costs for moving goods through the Red Sea. This is a place where 13 to 15% of global trade goes through the Red Sea because it's got to go through the Suez Canal. And this is right near the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, which is one of the strategic choke points in the maritime world. And that's where the Houthis are literally set up on one side of it. They have anti-ship missiles, drones, all sorts of capabilities. The USS Mason was recently attacked, and they had to fire back. So they are firing on U.S. warships at this time. If you go back before that, there was a big attack on multiple ships, 3 ships in one day. Plus, it appeared for a while, jury may still be out a little bit, as to where they were firing on the U.S. warship, the USS Carney, that came in to help them. With that, the U.S. has said, as of today, that they may start escorting commercial ships through the Red Sea. This reminds me almost of what the U.S. was doing in the Persian Gulf back in 1988 time period, where we U.S. flagged foreign tankers, and then we escorted them through the Strait of Hormuz past Iran, because Iran was attacking oil tankers and these ships going through the Strait of Hormuz. We haven't said we're going to reflag these ships, but what it looks like we're going to do is escort duty, if you will, which provides all that air defense, missile defense capability that we have on our warships to protect commercial ships in the area. And that's a big role. The U.S. has also said, as of today, that we're reaching out for foreign partners. We already have a number of foreign partners in there. In fact, the combined task group that's in there was recently headed by Egypt. So there's been a rotation of the task force commanders that have been in that area. Egypt was most recent. I would imagine with the U.S. throwing the preponderance of forces in there, that in the near term it might fall back under U.S. leadership. Again, that would be a normal thing to see. And I think you're going to see other countries, every major country, certainly in NATO, most major countries there have an interest in maintaining freedom of the seas and safe navigation through the Red Sea. And so wherever they stand on the conflict, even if they voted for a ceasefire, they definitely want to see the Red Sea continue to be open for commercial maritime traffic. So you're going to see a lot of focus on that, trying to counter this Houthi threat. And the Israeli one national security advisor for Israel, who's somebody I kind of pay attention to because of things he said in the past, has let it be known that Israel has taken a position that other countries can't go in and do something about the Houthi menace, if you will, to commercial ships and to the region, that Israel might take action. That was interesting to me. That potentially lines up a situation where the U.S. may make a decision that we're not going to put boots on the ground in Houthi-held Yemen to deal with this, but and this could be something that's a little bit down the pike, that the U.S. might provide naval gunfire, which could include missiles and rockets, along with 5-inch guns and other things, and also provide air support and taking out Houthi targets that menace shipping. And then Israel, at some point, may actually decide to do something on the ground, which could very likely include some of its rather unique special operations troops and special operations units to actually go in there and do that hard work of running raids on particular sites where missiles are located. And I will say this, Israel does know how to do this. The other thing, too, is there might be some U.S. presence in that. I used to do a lot of things, but one of the things I did was I ran a special team that we would parachute in and link up with host nation forces, or we would go in with other forces, and we would coordinate close air support and naval gunfire in support of their operations. And so it's very possible that those in that particular unit might be doing that today, working with the Israelis to deal with the Houthi threat. That is something I would not rule out at all, although we have many units that are capable of performing that function, working with partisan units and host nation units.
You know how the U.S. has also faced some criticism. I've had other experts here on the program to talk specifically about these attacks in the Red Sea. And one of them told me that they thought that the U.S. Seemed weak in the fact that they weren't aggressively pursuing the Houthi rebels, almost treated like a second class of terrorists, if you will.
Well, yeah, they are kind of a second class of terrorists. I can't disagree with that. I mean, look, they're bad. What they are, though, is they're pretty strong military force. You know, they fought the Yemeni government that was backed by the UAE and Saudi Arabia for quite some time. And whereas I never thought the Houthis as great as a particular, not in the same tone I would think of like ISIS or something like that, in terms of their ability to project terrorist attacks overseas, or like Al Qaeda once could. They are more regionally based. But one thing they do have is they have a lot of missile and drone capability, and a missile and drone capability that really dwarfs the previous two I just talked about. And within their own area, they're pretty strong. The problem is, you know, you had Saudi Arabia and the UAE in there for years trying to deal with the Houthi threat, and they eventually had to strike a deal. They could not eliminate them, and the Houthis know their terrain. They're on their home ground. They know every nook and cranny. They know every tunnel, every cave, every place up there, and it's very difficult to strike them from afar. And you know, literally, you could say, well, we're going to hit the buildings and stuff, but you end up with kind of the same problem we had after 9/11 with Afghanistan. You go in and blow up some buildings. You can do other things, and then you realize you're running out of normal targets to hit because they literally went to ground, because they're not really an industrial level country. They don't depend on industrial level capability to fight their wars. They can literally disappear into the hills, into these areas you can't hit any other way. Hence why some of these places you literally have to put boots on the ground. And I hope that if we do this, if we get involved and Israelis do it, and if we get involved with supporting it, along with some other countries, because Britain very much has a stake in this as well, because their ships have been targeted. Other countries have had a stake in this because their ships have been targeted. That if we do this, we look at something a little more asymmetric, such as going after specific sites, dealing with raid forces that go in and do this stuff, and some of the things, where you have a temporary preponderance of force, if you will, which is what raids are all about, where you have a temporary dominance and combat power on a specific piece of terrain, but you're not going to go in there and defend it forever. The problem is when we go in there and we try to stay there forever, that's where we run into problems, because at that point, everybody coalesces around you and you end up with something like the Taliban in Afghanistan towards the end, where they're all over the place. And, it's always, I'm not advocating raids for everything, but I'm saying in certain cases, raids are the right answer to go in and take out specific types of targets and threats.